On December 23, 1981, at 8:46 p.m., just 14 minutes before Barb Stoppel's shift at the Ideal Donut Shop in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, was supposed to end, a high-priority call came in to the Winnipeg police, who were dispatched to the donut shop in response to a robbery and possible rape. When police arrived, there were half a dozen people or so outside, yelling, trying to get their attention. "She's in there. I think she's dead," shouted one woman. Police found Barb Stoppel unconscious on her back in the women's bathroom in the southeast corner of the shop. She was fully outstretched with her left arm pinned under her body in a, quote, unusual position. As the officer felt for a pulse, he noticed a green and yellow nylon twine wrapped twice around her neck and tied in 2 knots. It was embedded so tightly that it hadn't been seen by those who initially found her. He hastily removed the twine and placed it on the bathroom sink. EMTs soon arrived and rushed Barb to the St. Boniface Hospital only seconds away. There were no cameras in the Ideal Donut Shop at the time, meaning that police would have to rely solely on eyewitnesses to help them in their search for Barb's attacker. And we all know how unreliable eyewitness accounts can be. But several eyewitnesses did come forward right away. They all had seen a man in a cowboy hat hanging around the donut shop, later locking the store door from the inside shortly before the attack. Some said that they saw him leaving the washroom moments before Barbara was found. He was then seen leaving the Ideal Donut Shop carrying a cardboard box and walking southeast behind the McDonald's restaurant. The man with the cowboy hat was described by witnesses as being a white male between the ages of 21 to 30 years old, with brown hair, a scruffy look, scraggly sideburns, and some noticeable acne. Police searched the area but could not find him, so they focused on detailing the events of the evening with the eyewitnesses available. Lorraine Janower was working at the Boots drugstore at the Dominion Shopping Center only seconds away. Just after 8 p.m., she walked to the Ideal Donut Shop to buy a coffee to help get her through the rest of her shift. As she crossed the parking lot, she saw a man inside the shop locking the front door. She felt this was odd and walked closer to the building, which had large glass windows fully exposing the interior. She recalled that the man was Caucasian, in his early 20s, with a poor complexion and noticeable acne on his face. His hair was brown and unkempt, and he had a long, scraggly mustache and sideburns. He wore dark-rimmed prescription glasses and a dark cowboy hat and brown cowboy boots with well-worn soles. His jeans were tight-fitting and faded. The unknown man turned around and walked to the rear of the store and into the women's washroom. Upset that perhaps it was the waitress's friend closing early, Lorraine Janower returned to work and called the owner to complain. There was no answer. Still not satisfied, she called the donut shop itself, and even more alarming, there was no answer. She had just seen a man in the store and wondered, why wasn't anyone picking up the phone? Several minutes later, her husband, Norman, arrived to pick her up. She was still angry at what she had seen earlier and asked him to have a look for himself. He walked over to the front of the shop where he saw the same man with the cowboy hat walk to the front window and flipped the sign to closed. The man then exited the store, brushing past him while carrying a cardboard box. "Don't bother, it's closed," the man said with a glib smile as he continued on his way past the McDonald's. This didn't sit right with Norman, who went inside the empty store and slowly walked towards the women's washroom. Now all the tables seemed to have been cleaned, and it seemed as if the store must have been closing early. And why not? It was Christmas time. Why was the front door left unlocked, and who was that guy with the cowboy hat? Norman reached the rear of the store and found that the door to the women's washroom was shut. He took a deep breath, opened it, and gasped as he stared, looking at a young girl unconscious on the floor. That stranger with the cowboy hat must have attacked her. He shouted for his wife to call the police, and saw the cowboy running across the parking lot towards the McDonald's. He noticed the young man standing by the doorway wearing a snowmobile suit and quickly told him to go after the man. Paul McDougald had been sitting in his truck in front of G&T television store, waiting for his wife to finish shopping. The television store faced the donut shop, and he had arrived just after 8 p.m. Between 8:15 to 8:20 p.m., he saw the strange man in the donut shop talking with the waitress, who was alone. He walked behind the counter by the cash register with her, then went to the back of the store and entered the kitchen area out of sight. He saw the two of them walk to the serving area by the round table, and they appeared to be talking. The man then stopped at the cash register and appeared to do something, but he couldn't make out what he was doing. The strange man then went to the front door and locked it and walked to the women's washroom. About 10 minutes went by, and then he saw the same man leave the washroom, crouching down and crawling behind the round counter. Paul McDougall's eyes were glued to what he was watching. The strange guy then stood up and casually walked to the front door. He slowly turned the sign to closed with his left hand and unlocked it with his right, calmly walking out towards the McDonald's carrying a cardboard box. 23-year-old John Dorkson was selling Christmas trees in the parking lot of the shopping center. He went to the Ideal Donut Shop for a coffee at 8:35 p.m. and found that the door was locked. There was no one visible inside, and he waited outside for several minutes and then saw a man with a cowboy hat exit the women's washroom, shut the door, then crouched down behind the counter. He went towards the cash register, stood up, took a cardboard box from his shelf, and walked around the counter towards the front door. Like the other witnesses, Dorkson also observed the man flip the sign to closed, unlock the front door, and leave. Dorkson then heard Norman Genauer's shouts to go after the man with the cowboy hat, and he followed him running behind the McDonald's restaurant. He had no idea what the man had done, but he was determined to catch him. He caught up with the man on the Norwood Bridge and tackled him. They both fell to the ground. As they struggled, Dorkson bellowed, "What the hell happened back there?" Dorkson eased his grip on the man as he pleaded his innocence, stating, "There's nothing going on. I was just locking up." Confused as to why he was even chasing the man in the first place, he let go and quickly stood up. The man got off the ground and pulled a knife, gesturing at Dorkson and shouting, "Stay away or I'll throw it at you." Dorkson slowly backed up in fear. He walked back to the mall parking lot and kept looking back as the man with the cowboy hat continued to run north over the bridge, stopping only once to throw something over the side. When Dorkson got back to the mall parking lot, he saw police interviewing people outside the donut shop. But instead of telling them where the man was heading, he decided to track him down himself. He hailed a taxi and tried to find the man he wrestled with just a few moments earlier. He instructed the cab driver, to take him over the bridge in what would prove to be a futile search for the cowboy. The taxi dropped him off at home, where he dwelled on the encounter and consumed 5 cold beers. About an hour later, he called the St. Boniface Hospital to check on Barb's condition. He knew her only briefly through the shop, and finally he relayed what had occurred earlier, and police investigators were immediately summoned. When police heard Dorkson's story, they rushed to the area of the riverbank and began searching for whatever may have been discarded over the side of the bridge. And on the riverbank, they found 2 gloves. The left glove was found with green twine and white facial tissue. They found a cardboard box with 1 salmon-colored coffee stick inside. There were also possible suspect footprints in the snow, which were noted and photographed. News of the attack spread quickly, and Barb's family and friends rushed to the St. Boniface Hospital to be with her. Welcome back to Unjust Crimes. My name is Michelle, and this is part 1 of the unsolved murder of Barb Stoppel from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Okay, so I told you that 16-year-old Barb Stoppel, or Barbara Stoppel, was found unconscious in the bathroom of the donut shop where she was working. Witnesses saw a man leave the store and take off. He had been seen in the store with Barb a few minutes before she was found, and had been seen following her to the bathroom. So we pretty much know that he was the attacker. Who he was, though, witnesses and police did not know. Pretty much all the police had to go on here was witness accounts, and well, we all know how unreliable they can be. What could have been the motive for this attack? Barb did not appear to have been sexually assaulted. Police did, though, determine that $33 was stolen from the cash register, but Barb's purse still contained $24.75. Could this have been a robbery gone horribly wrong? Several eyewitnesses assisted in creating a composite drawing of the suspect, and the police established a timeline of the events leading up to and during the assault. They found that there had been many sightings of the possible suspect throughout the day at the mall itself. The last known customer at the donut shop left at 8:15 p.m., and he recalled that the waitress was alone and she was talking on the phone. Barb's friend Darlene Church reported that she was on the phone with her at 8 p.m. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes, and there was no indication that anything was wrong. Several other witnesses claimed to have seen a man matching the description of the composite drawing and wearing a cowboy hat. The manager of the McDonald's saw the man in his store at around 4 p.m. An employee at the Dominion store saw the cowboy enter his store at 6 p.m. An employee at the Norwood Hotel coffee shop saw him in her shop at 3 p.m. Actually, another employee of this coffee shop saw him twice that day, once at noon and again at 5 p.m. According to this employee, he was drinking coffee and reading a paperback book. An employee at Shoe Save saw him in her store at approximately 4 p.m. He was asking about cowboy boots and presented himself in a friendly manner. The manager of Shoe Save, who also saw the cowboy in her store at approximately 3 p.m., said that she last saw him walking in the direction of the McDonald's. An employee at R.B. Ormiston Florists in the mall said that she saw the man in her store between 7 and 8 p.m., and he had asked her what time the store was open. Another employee at the Ideal Donut Shop, who had had the shift prior to Barb's on the date of the attack, said that prior to 3:30 p.m., she saw a man dressed like a cowboy sitting in her store. He was eating pistachios and commenting on country music. She described him as being a Caucasian male, tall and thin, wearing a brown cowboy hat, jeans, and a short jacket. Employees at the McDonald's restaurant reported that they saw the cowboy twice inside, once at 7:30 p.m., where he was drinking a coffee by himself and reading a paperback book. He was also seen at approximately 8:15 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Police believe that the cowboy who was seen inside the Ideal Donut Shop was in fact the same cowboy that was seen several times that day at the mall. Hair samples were located on top of the toilet tank in the women's washroom where Barb was found, and these were found to be consistent with Barb's hair, suggesting that she had struck her head on the toilet and may have been knocked out. Apart from slight bruising to the inner portions of both of her arms and a bruise behind her right ear, there were actually no signs of a struggle. The twine that was found around Barb's neck was the same as the twine that was found under the Norwood Bridge. The gloves that were located under the Norwood Bridge were a matching pair, and the left glove had twine that was consistent with the twine that was around Barb's neck. Crime lab results also found an acrylic textile on the gloves consistent with Barb's sweater, thereby connecting the gloves to the attacker. In other words, he had worn those gloves. A soiled facial tissue found with the gloves had a dark-colored synthetic fiber not consistent with any of Barb's clothing. That was probably most likely from the suspect. A saliva stain was located on the rear of Barb's pants, and that was found to be the same as the DNA in a piece of gum located on the bathroom floor, and both belonged to Barb. However, mixed in with this saliva was a small quantity of male DNA. The sample was so minute, though, that it could not be used to confirm the donor's identity. Also, while this sample may have belonged to the attacker, it could have also belonged to a number of people like medical staff or police, and so on. There were no other evidence of male DNA on any other exhibits. Although the twine that was around Barb's neck was not tested, it was believed to have been manufactured by Powers Twine in Washington, D.C., in the United States, who sold it to BC Hydro. Representatives from that company stated that the twine was similar in configuration. 3 unidentified palm prints were lifted from the middle of the door, and these prints could have been made by also a number of people like emergency personnel or even customers during the day, or may have been the suspects, although we do think that he was probably wearing gloves. Another right index fingerprint was lifted on the donut shop's door near the locking mechanism. Once again, it could have been made by the suspect, a customer, or an emergency personnel. The twine found under the bridge was determined by investigators to be the same twine that was used to strangle Barb. So we know now that the man that left the donut shop, which we knew anyways, was the attacker. Police worked diligently looking for leads as Barb laid unconscious in the hospital. Her mother had held vigil by her side day and night until December 29th, 1981 at 9:30 a.m. when Barb was pronounced dead, and the cause of her death was strangulation. More than 700 tips came into police over the next few months. One of the only pieces of concrete evidence in this case was the twine. It was soon determined that it was manufactured by Powers Twine from Everson, Washington, and sent to companies in the Vancouver area, and these distributors subsequently sold it to BC Hydro. As a result, Winnipeg police investigators believe that the suspect had a British Columbia or BC connection. Barbara or Barb Stoppel was born on August 9, 1965 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. She was the third child of loving parents, Muriel and Fred Stoppel. At the time of her murder, she was the only child still living at home. Her older brother Rick and her sister Roxanne were both married and off living their own lives in Winnipeg. Barb was said to be a typical teenager who was focused on school, sports, and boys. She was beautiful and she was smart. She did well in school and was said to be an outgoing person. Friends and family say that she was kind, friendly, and thoughtful. A soft-hearted girl who saw the good in everybody. Apparently roller skating was a thing to do in this time in Winnipeg, probably everywhere, and Barb spent her time roller skating at Saint's roller rink and playing basketball and volleyball. The caption under her 1980 school yearbook photo read, quote, "If her ankle isn't broken roller skating, it's basketball." Barb was said to be more mature than most girls her age, and she sought out an older group of friends, and she was also said to be very popular. She had big dreams and wanted to become a famous actress. She studied acting at the Manitoba Theatre Workshop, and after tryouts on December 9th, 1981, she had been given the lead role in her school's annual play. The part-time job at the donut shop was a new job for Barb. She had only been there for a few weeks, actually. She was working as a waitress, and it was said that she was the type of person who would talk to customers for hours without even have knowing them before. She had an air of confidence about her with a caring disposition that some creeps, I would say, might interpret as flirtatious, although that was not her intention. On Wednesday, December 23rd, 1981, 16-year-old Barb couldn't have been more excited for Christmas. She had a new boyfriend and was looking forward to spending Christmas with her family. Barb was originally scheduled to work on December 23rd, but had agreed to switch days with a coworker and work the 22nd instead. But at the last minute, her coworker changed her mind and switched it back. Barb had been grounded for not doing her chores, but she was allowed to go to work and do her shift at the donut shop, which was from 4 to 9 in the evening, and she was scheduled to work alone. As she got ready for work that day, she rushed around the house deciding on what clothes to wear and making sure that her hair and makeup were perfect. You know, typical 16-year-old girl things. She chose a pair of white pants and a white-colored knit sweater. She said goodbye to her mother and left out the back door. It was 3:30 p.m., and that was the last time that Muriel Stoppel would see her daughter alive. After a couple of months of following leads, Thomas Safano entered into the mix. At the time of Barb's murder, he was a 28-year-old Caucasian male who was 6 feet 4 inches tall, 180 pounds, with brown curly hair, brown eyes, long sideburns, Fu Manchu mustache, slim build, and wore gold-rimmed glasses. If you don't know what a Fu Manchu mustache is, I didn't either. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but anyways, picture Hulk Hogan. Anyway, Thomas Safano was a resident of BC who had been visiting Winnipeg on the day of the attack, December 23rd, 1981, attempting to see his daughter Kimberly. He had a strained relationship with his ex-wife Nadine, and she had refused to allow him to visit with his daughter. I believe their daughter was 2 at the time. Safano dropped off his daughter's presents at his ex-sister-in-law and ex-brother-in-law's house, and they were Diane and Alex Klein. Safano then decided to drive to Mexico. He left Winnipeg driving south, but soon turned around due to pulling in the front end of his car. He subsequently went to Canadian Tire on Pembina Highway for servicing and learned that the caliper was seizing. Once his car was fixed, he decided that he was just going to return to British Columbia, after first stopping for coffee at a Tim Hortons on Portage Avenue in Winnipeg. Sometime during the initial hours of his drive, he heard on the radio that a girl in a donut shop had been assaulted. Having just been in a coffee shop, he called his sister in BC and asked if police were looking for him in the event it was the same Tim Hortons. She advised him that the police had not called. He later stopped at Ryan's restaurant in Hope, BC, and saw a poster of a missing girl, Verna Berkey. And I don't think I said that right. It's spelled B-J-E-R-K-Y. Anyway, Safano believed that he may have seen that girl in Winnipeg and subsequently called the RCMP, who took a formal statement. In the statement, Safano gave a Winnipeg address. In turn, this prompted the RCMP to forward a request for follow-up to Winnipeg investigators regarding that girl's disappearance. months. The request landed on the desk of Sergeant Bill Vandergraff of the Winnipeg Police Department. Now, Vandergraff was unable to locate Thomas Safano in Winnipeg, and since Safano had come from BC, this detective decided to look up his Winnipeg identification picture from 1977 and found that it was quite similar to the composite drawing of the suspect in Barb Stoppel's murder. Sergeant Vandergraff subsequently initiated an investigation into Thomas Safano. On February 16th, 56 days after Barb's murder, Sergeant Vandergraff started interviewing several of Safano's contacts in Winnipeg, including his ex-wife, Nadine Safano, Diane and Alex Klein, his former girlfriend, Jacqueline Henke, and a friend, Cindy Coe. Nadine felt that Tom fit the description of the composite drawing. She also felt that he was capable of blowing up, and she was afraid of him, although he had never assaulted her in the past. The Kleins said that Thomas Safano went to their house at 3:30 p.m. on December 23rd to drop off Kimberly's Christmas gifts and left their house at around 5 p.m. He was wearing a 3/4 length brown leather coat with another jacket underneath, brown dress pants, tinted glasses, cowboy boots, and he had a mustache. When asked if he was wearing a cowboy hat, they advised that he was not. Former girlfriend Jacqueline Henke reported that the two lived together on Mayfair in Winnipeg, just on the other side of the bridge from the Dominion Shopping Center. She also recalled that Thomas did have a cowboy hat, which he bought in the summer of 1981, and he wore it regularly. Also of note, she recalled that Thomas carried a knife and attended the Dominion Shopping Center on occasion to eat at the McDonald's. More interesting to investigators, she recalled that she had seen yellow rope in his car before. Henke and her friend Cindy Coe both believed that Safano matched the description of the composite drawing, but neglected to call police because they thought that he was in BC at the time of the attack. So here you have this man who closely resembled the composite drawing, who was in Winnipeg on the day of the murder, who was known to carry a knife, and who was upset at not being allowed to see his daughter. All of this provided investigators with grounds to consider Thomas Safano, quote, a person of interest in the case. More compelling than all of that, Safano was from BC, and remember the twine that had been used to kill Barb Stoppel had ties to BC, and this connection police felt may have linked Safano to the murder weapon. The ball was now placed in the hands of Vancouver detective Mike Bernard because Safano was back in BC. So on March 3rd, 1982, Detective Bernard completed an initial interview with Thomas Safano and forwarded to Winnipeg investigators. Some things that he noted in his interview was he said that he had arrived in Winnipeg on December 22nd, 1981, and had left Winnipeg on December 24th, 1981, and that he was back in Vancouver by December 25th of 1981. He said that he had contacted Nadine's parents and spoke to Nadine on their phone. She wouldn't tell him where she or their daughter was, and that he had left his daughter's presence with Diane and Alex Klein, and that was about 4 p.m. on December 23rd. He thought around 5 p.m. he was talking to Nadine from a phone booth near the A&W at Sherbrooke and Portage Avenue. After that, he just remembered driving around the area of the Health Science Center on Notre Dame and Sherbrooke. He remembered going to a country kitchen on Main Street and Mayfair and having coffee. He also remembered going to a donut shop, having a coffee, no donut. He didn't remember exactly where, but he was going to visit a female friend in St. Boniface, but she wasn't there. He said driving back to BC, he had stopped for coffee but couldn't remember what street it was on. When asked if the street could have been Goulet, he said yes. He didn't know because he didn't know St. Boniface at all. He said that the donut shop was like a Tim Hortons, but he couldn't remember who was at the donut shop or if there was a male or female staff, and that he only had a coffee, no donut. When shown the composite drawing, he admitted that the hat was the same. He admitted to having a blue tote bag, but that he wasn't carrying it. He had left it where he was staying at the time. He said that he wasn't wearing his hat and that the hat was in his car. Safano said that he never carried knives, and if his wife had said so, she was lying. He said that he could have been at the Ideal Donut Shop around that time, but he couldn't remember the exact address or the name of the coffee shop. He said he finished driving at 11 p.m. and went home to bed. He said that when he went for a donut, his car, a 71 Monte Carlo 2-door, dark blue, was parked just before the shop. He said that he was willing to take a polygraph test regarding any questions to do with this girl's death. On March 10, 1982, Sergeant Vandergraff contacted Detective Bernard in Vancouver. Bernard described Sofano as being rather strange but cooperative and had an air of calmness about him with no apparent emotion. Bernard also informed Vandergraff that he told Sofano police had his prints in the donut shop and asked him where they would have found them. Sofano believed that his prints would have been on a cup and a spoon. Bernard further said that Sofano's prints were also located in the washroom, to which Sofano denied ever entering. Sofano allowed himself to be photographed and voluntarily allowed Detective Bernard to seize his cowboy hat and search his vehicle. With the exception of the hat, he found nothing of interest. He believed that Sofano should be considered a possible suspect. On March 11th, a Polaroid picture of Sofano wearing his cowboy hat was combined with 7 other Polaroid photos of suspects and shown to witnesses Norman and Lorraine Janauer. 5 of the individuals, including Sofano, were wearing cowboy hats and glasses. The remaining 2 were not. Lorraine Janauer picked out Sofano's photo and stated, quote, "If anything, he'd be like this." Her husband also picked the same photo and stated, quote, "This guy, I know him from somewhere. I don't know why." On March 12, 1982, almost 3 months after Barb's murder, Winnipeg police investigator Sergeant Wayne Warwick and Ed Polishine arrived at the doorstep of Sofano's house accompanied by Detective Bernard. Sofano was asked to attend the Vancouver police station for a formal interview and he complied willingly. The interrogation/interview was not videotaped or recorded but written in investigators' notebooks. The result of several hours of interviewing and interrogating was damning for Sofano. During the course of questioning, he had placed himself in the Ideal Donut shop at the time of the murder. 2 witnesses had already picked his photo. Although nothing seized from Thomas Sofano would prove to link him to the murder, one further damning conversation would. So Thomas Sofano was aggressively interrogated by police. He was not informed of his right to counsel, and he was strip-searched. And in an effort to force a confession from him, police informed him that his fingerprints had been found in the donut store and that 5 witnesses had already identified him. Thomas Sofano eventually became persuaded that he had killed Barb Stoppel and had blacked out afterwards, remembering little of the crime. And he confessed this to police. Even though this interrogation lasted several hours, only 15 minutes of transcribed notes were produced from his interrogation and confession. Now, police are required by law to write everything down verbatim as much as possible, if it's not being recorded. So obviously, if they interrogated him for hours and they only wrote down 15 minutes of transcribed notes, we know that there was a lot missing out of that. So police kept Thomas Sofano in custody, and the next day, they put an undercover cop in the adjoining cell. This undercover cop spent 4 hours chatting with Sofano, who maintained that he was arrested for, quote, stabbing a girl in a donut shop in Winnipeg, but he still denied killing anybody. He said, quote, "I was driving around Winnipeg. I parked on the street and went in the donut shop and locked the door. I don't even know what donut shop I was in. I don't know Winnipeg well. They say it was on Goulette in St. Boniface, just outside of Winnipeg." Sofano maintained that he had nothing to hide, but he later told the undercover cop that he had just got his alibi because he now recalled 2 people who could vouch for him. Unfortunately for Thomas Sofano, though, he repeatedly indicated with his hands how he had locked the door. So just of note here that while he was being interrogated, it would later come out that the police kept repeatedly making the motion of locking the door in front of his face and shouting at him while they were interrogating him. And I don't know, I guess this got ingrained in his brain, and for some weird reason, when he was talking to this undercover investigator, he kept repeating the same motion that the cops were doing in his face, like he was locking the door. And now police, though, they took this motion of him repeatedly making with his hands the motion that he was locking the door, that he had indeed actually locked the door, like the witnesses said that the perpetrator did. And this movement that he repeatedly made with his hands would prove to be a circumstantial problem in his defense. Compounding the issue, he had just spent 14 hours with police and had yet to disclose an alibi. On March 12, 1982, police announced that they had found and arrested the man who had become known as the Cowboy. killer. Though they had no concrete evidence linking Thomas Safano to the crime, police continued to piece together evidence from eyewitnesses. On March 13, 1982, a physical lineup was conducted with John Dorkson viewing Safano and several other people. Now, Dorkson had been the one that was fighting with the attacker on the Norwood Bridge, and he potentially had the best look at the attacker. Officers in attendance documented that, quote, he was unable to make a positive identification at this point. On March 15th, the same lineup was presented for Norman Genauer, Marcel Glue, and Mildred King, who were all eyewitnesses. Norman Genauer stated, quote, from what I can see, I'd say number 7, who was of course Thomas Safano. He's about the right height and weight and walks just like the guy. Genauer then asked Winnipeg Police Sergeant Ken Biner if he had selected the right guy, prompting Sergeant Biner to reply that he had picked the person being investigated as the suspect. Marcel Glue then viewed the live lineup and was positive that the suspect he saw fighting with Dorkson on the bridge that night was not in the group of men. Mildred King, who had initially stated that the suspect was not in the lineup, but as they left the room, she stated, quote, no, I can't swear. Number 7 was the closest from the side view, the right side view. And of course, that would be Thomas Safano. So John Dorkson decided to go to the courthouse and see the person that they had arrested. His plans were sidelined, though, as he was spot-checked by police and found to have a warrant of his committal for his arrest. Police detained him in the remand center, even though he indicated that he had the money to pay this fine at home. While in custody, he had a, quote, chance meeting with Thomas Safano. Now, he was able to identify Thomas Safano and would testify to this in court. And this really strengthened the case against Thomas Safano. Police investigators continued to verify Safano's recollection of events surrounding the day of the murder. Luckily for him, he did have phone records, and they proved to be invaluable in pinpointing where he was at specific times that day. So what was known is that he was at Diane and Alex Klein's at 3:38 p.m. He called his sister at 5:25 p.m. He left the Klein's approximately 5:30 p.m. The confirmed time that he called his ex-wife from the phone booth near Notre Dame and Portage was 7:52 p.m. The confirmed time that he called his mother in BC from the Canadian Tire store located at 2195 Pembina Highway was 7:56 p.m. and the confirmed time that that call ended was at 7:56 p.m. The most problematic call he made that day for the prosecution was the call from Canadian Tire on Pembina Highway at 7:52 p.m. because that was some 14 to 19 minutes away from the Ideal Donut Shop. And police confirmed that the call was made and lasted 4 minutes, ending at 7:56 p.m. A full 14 to 24 minutes from when the cowboy was first seen by witnesses in the store. It may have been the most important call that Thomas Safano had ever made, but still, the case against him soldiered on. The Crown argued that Thomas Safano went to Winnipeg to see his daughter and became enraged when his ex-wife denied him. They would argue that he had more than enough time to leave the Canadian Tire store and murder Barb for whatever motive. Although there was questionable identification initially, John Dorkson would testify that Thomas Safano was the man that he had wrestled with on the bridge that night. Also, Mildred King, who initially stated during the suspect lineup, quote, no, he's not there, would later identify Thomas Safano in court. Lorraine and Norman Genauer would also identify Thomas Safano in court. The Crown's case was strengthened by the similarity to the composite and by Safano's own comments to police during his interviews. He placed himself inside the Ideal Donut Shop at the same time of Barb's murder. He had a BC connection, he had a cowboy hat, he wore cowboy boots, and he even told an undercover officer that he had locked the door. Several jailhouse informants also implicated Thomas Safano. So his fate seemed to be sealed. Even though there was no forensic evidence linking Thomas Safano to the crime scene or logical motive, the Crown focused on his comments to police, comments to convicts, and the twine coming from BC. The defense lawyers for Thomas Sofino argued that this was a case of mistaken identity. They would highlight the fact that Thomas Sofino was at a Canadian Tire store 14 to 19 minutes away from the crime scene and could not have been the killer. This distance was traveled by many a lawyer and policeman over the years, with similar times recorded. Sofino would testify himself that once he left the Canadian Tire store, he drove to the St. Boniface and Misericordia hospitals and delivered candy stockings for children. He then went to the Tim Hortons on Portage Avenue for a coffee, then dropped off more stockings at the Grace Hospital. He would admit that he did not disclose his alibi initially to police because he didn't think it was important. He also defended some of his remarks during police interviews, testifying that it was Sergeant Paula Shine who told him the murder occurred between 8 and 9. Further, until he saw the phone logs, he did not know what time he was at Canadian Tire, as it had been months earlier. A preliminary inquiry, though, determined that Thomas Sofino should stand trial for the murder of Barbara Stoppel. The first trial was in 1982, which resulted in a mistrial as a result of a hung jury on November 6, 1982. In 1983, he went through another second trial, this time with a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. When the verdict was read out loud, Sofino whispered, quote, "I didn't do it." This verdict, though, was later overturned by the Court of Appeal and a third trial was ordered. The third trial was in 1985 and resulted in yet another guilty decision. But fortunately, this decision was later overturned and a verdict of acquittal was entered. The Manitoba Court of Appeal not only reversed the conviction based again on errors made by the trial judge, but it ruled that Thomas Sofino could not be tried a fourth time. Of course, the Crown appealed this decision, but on April 22, 1986, 5 years after Barb's murder, the courts denied the prosecution's appeal and entered a decision that there would be no further prosecution of Thomas Sofino, and he was formally acquitted on December 12, 1985. The general feeling of the courts, police, and politicians was that Thomas Sofino had successfully gotten away with murder. Having spent a total of 4 years behind bars and having lived most of his adult life under the shadow of an ongoing murder prosecution, Thomas Sofino was exonerated and received a full apology from the Manitoba government. This marked the beginning of Thomas Sofino's plea for review of the case. He wanted the person actually responsible for Barb Stoppel's murder to be caught. But nobody seemed to care, and his pleas fell on many deaf ears for many years, including the police, the courts, and politicians. Just listen to one of his appeals for a review. Quote, "I'm pleading with you, the media, to do anything you can to help me put an end to this matter, and help me disclose the one thing I've been fighting for all this time, the truth. I would have to say here that if he truly was guilty, he would not be pursuing this. A guilty man would have shut his mouth and enjoyed his freedom, not try to bring this whole thing up again and possibly uncover something that could prove that he was in fact guilty. But nobody wanted to hear it. My guess? They were embarrassed and knew that they had fucked up. Until CJOB radio journalist and talk show host Peter Warren contacted Thomas Sofino and requested that he go on his show. Of course, Sofino eagerly agreed, and while on air he gave out Manitoba Premier Gary Filmon's private phone number, demanding people call it if they felt he was guilty of murder and demand the case be reopened. He also requested that those who believed him innocent should also call and demand the case be reviewed. The phone response was so large that it prompted the Premier to change his number, and more pressure was put on the police to finally review this case. As controversy grew about whether the police had bungled the Barb Stoppel investigation, 3 reviews of the case would eventually be conducted, including an internal Winnipeg police inquiry by Constable John Burchell. And this is where Winnipeg Detective Sergeant Andrew Mikolajewski comes into this story, because he was part of the review team on the internal police inquiry, and this inquiry was called the Burchell Report. Now, Detective Sergeant Miko Lajewski actually wrote a book about Barb Stoppel's case called Stoppel. And that is where I got most of my information, especially information concerning the crime and who the real killer is. Now, in his book, he said even before nursery school, everybody called him Miko. So that's probably what I will use throughout this podcast because I know I definitely butchered his name, as I do with most names. So anyway, the review team consisted of Detective Sergeant Andrew Miko, or Miko Lajewski, I'm just going to say Miko, Sergeant Blair Vaughan, and Detective Sergeant Bob Blake. Now, the results of this review were not actually made public. However, Winnipeg Police Chief Jack Iwatsky did concede in 2000 that the investigation had been botched. And on June 8, 2000, he exonerated Thomas Sofano of any wrongdoing. The Burchell report was subsequently sent to the Office of the Chief of Police with a recommendation to have investigators assigned to follow it up. The investigators assigned to follow up the report were the same team that was put together on the Burchell report: Detective Sergeant Miko, Detective Legge, and Detective Vaughan. A public inquiry was also called to determine why the justice system had imprisoned an innocent man. And this inquiry led to Thomas Sofano receiving compensation of $2.6 million, which I will say I don't think was enough. Peter Corey, a former Supreme Court of Canada judge, was appointed by the provincial government to preside over the inquiry. In his 2001 report, Justice Corey described the Sofano case as, quote, a flagrant instance of tunnel vision, where other viable suspects were ignored, as the police relentlessly built a case around the man they had become convinced was the murderer. To illustrate this, he cited the suppression of evidence from a BC Hydro employee who had concluded that the twine used to strangle Barb Stoppel was produced by a Manitoba company, rather than the factory located in Washington. Justice Corey observed that police could have tested the twine back in 1981 for a mere $100, but they chose not to. Can you believe that twine was never tested? Justice Corey was very critical of, quote, startling unfair police procedures, which included the use of a hypnotist to enhance Mr. John Dorkson's memory. Now, he was the eyewitness that had tackled with the attacker on the bridge, and an, quote, unconscionable strip search of Thomas Sofano as part of the interrogation. Justice Corey said police photo lineup procedures were conducted in such a way as to produce the results that officers wanted. Police actively prodded eyewitnesses towards reaching the conclusions they hoped for, or arranged photos in such a way that Sofano was likely to be singled out. Just a few examples of that include when Detective Sergeant Miko and his team went and spoke to John Dorkson in the review of the case in 1999. Like I said, he was the guy who had wrestled with the attacker on the bridge. Anyway, it became clear very quickly that this guy Dorkson could not identify any person that he was fighting with that night. After all of these years, he claimed that he had been wearing glasses on the night of December 23rd, 1981, but lost them, and this is why he kept identifying the wrong suspects. He admitted to fabricating the entire event of taking a cab across the bridge to look for the cowboy. He had lied in the preliminary hearing in all 3 trials. He said that he made the story up to make himself look better and cover for his irrational actions of simply going home. He confessed that he was told by police who the killer was after a lineup. An officer told him, quote, "That's the guy. John, that's the guy we got to do this. We were even given information to show Sofano was the killer." Detective Sergeant Miko also spoke with the identification officer originally assigned to the case back in 1981. He said that one of the investigators pressured him to say that the footprints in the snow that were made by the killer were the same as Sofano's boot imprint. Although this man decided not to lie, he never brought this up in court or the inquiry. Lorraine Genauer, she was the eyewitness now that had seen the attacker in the shop, the one who had called the shop but got no answer, the lady who sent her husband to go and see what was going on at the donut shop because she just knew something was off. Well, she admitted to picking Sofano out of a photo lineup because, quote, "it was easy enough because it was so different from the rest." She was asked if the composite and the photo helped her identify Safano in court, to which she replied, quote, "They helped me identify him. I don't know if I could have recognized him in court without them being the police." She was adamant that the person who came into the Boots drugstore and asked for twine at 5:15 p.m. on the day of the murder was the same person that she saw leaving the Ideal Donut shop at 8:30 p.m. This, of course, could not have been Thomas Safano because he was at the Kleins at that time, that 5:15 p.m. When Norman Genauer, now he was Lorraine Genauer's husband, he was the one that she sent to the donut shop the night Barb was attacked. He was the one who found Barb, and the attacker passed him on his way out of the donut shop. Well, when he viewed the photo lineup back in 1982, he commented on Safano's photo, saying, quote, "This guy, I know him from somewhere, I don't know why. I couldn't be sure with the pictures." Now that's hardly a positive identification. And when he viewed the live lineup with Safano in attendance, he stated, quote, "From what I see, I'd say number 7, which was of course Thomas Safano. But again, this is not a solid identification, especially after he was shown Thomas Safano's photo earlier. Norman Genauer asked Detective Biner if he had picked out the right guy, to which Detective Biner replied that he had picked out the person being investigated as the suspect. Having not really been able to identify Thomas Safano in either photo pack or the live lineup, Norman Genauer went on to identify Thomas Safano in his trials. Now, Mildred King, who was another eyewitness, and she had viewed the live lineup. She was asked if she could see the suspect, to which she replied no. When asked if she was positive, she said yes. And as the men were being escorted out, she requested that the last 5 men be viewed again. At this time, she commented, quote, "No, I can't swear. Number 7 was the closest from the side view, the right side view." Of course, that was Thomas Safano, but once again, that was not a positive identification. But yet, at the preliminary hearing and all 3 trials, she was positive in identifying Thomas Safano as the man she saw on December 23rd, 1981. Now, besides all of these weak eyewitness identifications, neither the police nor the Crown shared the weakness of this identification of the suspect to the defense counsel. I mean, surely if they had, and this was known to the jury, I think it would have been really hard for them to convict. Finally, Justice Corey's report condemned the use of jailhouse informants, including one who had 26 fraud charges that were later dropped in recognition of his testimony against Thomas Safano. Justice Corey said, quote, "The psychological scarring that Safano has suffered is just as grave and just as permanent as would be the loss of a limb." He recommended that Safano receive $2.6 million in compensation payments, which I do not think is near enough. Where did all of this leave Barb Stoppel's family? I can't even imagine. To think that they sat through a preliminary inquiry and 3 trials. To think that they got the bastard to, oh shit, they let him out. They must have thought Thomas Safano got away with murdering Barb. And then to find out that the police had screwed the whole case up and the killer was probably still out there all these years. I can't imagine the roller coaster of emotions. Rick Stoppel, who was Barb's older brother, has said that he spent so many years of his life hating a man because he was convinced the man murdered his little sister, Thomas Safano. But it turned out that he was innocent all along. Quote, "I spent so much time hating Tom. It was just such a waste of time and energy and rage because in the end, the guy was innocent. We went through the preliminary hearing, the first trial, the second trial, third trial, the Supreme Court of Canada, and then the inquiry. All of that is what I've lived with through my life based on people that are in charge and seem to make such a mess of this in our case." While the horror of all that had happened haunted the Stoppel family for so many decades, it also haunted Thomas Safano, and he was living his own personal nightmare. Then came the next ordeal for the Stoppel family, the hunt for the real killer. And this hunt for the real killer began in 1999 when the investigators from the Burchell Report were assigned to follow up the case. Police Detective Sergeant Andrew Miko, working with Sergeant Blair Vaughan and Detective Sergeant Bob Legg, the team knew very soon who the real killer was, and they were shocked that this person was not charged way back when all this happened, because his name was all over the reports. In fact, this person was initially considered a suspect, but seemingly he just slipped through the cracks when investigators got stuck on Thomas Sofano. Detective Sergeant Miko said in his book, Stoppel, that the real killer was so prevalent in the reports that it was as if he was just waving his arms. I'll go over some things that were found in this review that will make you go, oh my god, how could the police not see this? Though I often try to hold out hope that the police are working with good intentions and do their best to get to the truth, I have to say, this case made me rethink that belief. It's shockingly apparent that that is not always the case. I'm always the one to give the police some credit, they know what they're doing, and so on. But I have to say, after researching this case, I'm not sure what to think anymore. I'm not an idiot. I know bad police do exist, and it's been proven many, many times, but I guess maybe naively, I still want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But then you read something like this, and you really don't know what to think anymore. But police in this case, the original police in this case in 1981-82, that investigated the murder of Barb Stoppel and who charged Thomas Sofano with her murder, had the most obvious case of tunnel vision that I have ever come across. The killer was right there in the reports all along. Like, what in the actual hell? I don't understand. I'm not even going to try to sugarcoat it. The police royally fucked up big time and wrongfully put an innocent man in prison and let a monster go. And what do you think this monster did all these years that he was free? Well, what do you think? He went on to rape and murder several women. He was even incarcerated at one point for raping 3 young children and imprisoned another time for the murder of another young teenage girl. I read in the book Stoppel that the number of sexual assaults this monster committed in his time was just too many to even talk about. So in other words, the few that are mentioned are only the tip of the iceberg. And what about all the ones that we don't even know about? How many unsolved murders did this monster commit in his time? We may never know. All avoidable if he would have just been caught for killing Barb Stoppel all the way back in 1981. Like, holy shit, the Winnipeg police let a serial rapist and killer loose on the streets? And I can't believe that I'm just learning about this story now. I have to say, as I was reading the book Stoppel and doing research online, I was absolutely riveted. I could hardly believe what I was reading. Okay, so back to the review of Barb Stoppel's murder. As I've mentioned, the most important piece of evidence that was left behind was the twine. Besides the twine, all the police had to go on was eyewitness accounts. We all know how unreliable they can be. At the time of the murder, police said that the twine was manufactured in the US in Washington and was used by BC Hydro. And this in turn led them to believe that the suspect had ties to BC, or British Columbia. But the twine was never actually tested when Barb was murdered. The twine wasn't actually tested until 1999. The frigging twine was actually manufactured by a company in Portage-la Prairie in Manitoba all along. There was absolutely no connection between the murder weapon and BC whatsoever. The wrongful presumption that the twine had ties to BC prompted them to focus on that lead, which in turn led them to focus on Thomas Sofano. And this test that police could have done way back in 1981 would have cost them a measly $100. I have to do some more research or something on the mentality that it takes for police to railroad an innocent man, because I just don't get it. Shouldn't the police want to dot all their I's and cross all their T's? Why wasn't the simplest of tests done? And why did they ignore the obvious suspect that was all over the frickin' reports? Well, what I can tell you from reading the book Stoppel, now these are my words, not what Detective Sergeant Miko said in his book, but it was pure laziness. The simple task of reading the reports was not done because the review pointed out that if anybody had taken the time to read what was in the reports, Thomas Sofino would have never been railroaded. But police were hell-bent to put somebody away for the murder. What's the point, though, if it's the wrong person? I wonder what any of these cops, if any of them are still alive, think now, knowing that they let a monster go and that he killed at least 3 other young girls, probably more. Anyway, I could just go on and on and on with that, but I won't. Thank you for all the support. It truly is appreciated.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the unsolved murder of Barb Stoppel, and please stay tuned for part 2.
It still surprises me that anybody would want to support unjust crimes, but for anybody that would like to do that and help support the podcast, I have added a PayPal link to my YouTube page, and again, it is truly appreciated. These stories do take a lot of time to put together. You can follow Unjust Crimes on Facebook and Instagram, and I will put those links in the description to this video. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, thank you for your time and stay safe out there.